Need to soak my vocal cords for a second. It's worth noting, just in passing, that the Inquisition had been going for about 100 years, not in England specifically, but things were still paranoid enough that Chaucer, at the end of the Canterbury Tales, wrote an apology, just in case he'd offended somebody that he didn't want to offend, like, say, a high church person, or God. You don't want to offend God in 1380. Times change, but human nature does not change. Wise living calls us to learn from experience, but as military historian Basil Liddell Hart reminds us, there are two different kinds of experience. We can learn from our own experience. We're fools if we don't. And then again, we're also fools if we learn only from our own experience. That's too costly. A wise person learns as much as possible from the experiences of others. What happened long ago to people far away can tell us a lot about our own lives in the here and now. Roman Catholicism is, of course, big in the news right now. And it may seem as though the Catholic Inquisition, which began nearly 1,000 years ago, has little to do with modern Catholics and even less to do with us. But I suggest that the forces that drove it still drive reactionaries in our own time. And again, the wise person learns from the experiences of others. A person's opinion of the Inquisition kind of depends on where you stand. From our point of view, a 1500s book by a Puritan scholar named John Fox called The Book of Martyrs kind of sums up the Protestant attitude toward the Inquisition. As a Puritan, he had a low opinion of the Church of England, but he really hated Roman Catholics. He described Catholicism in general and the Inquisition in particular as hostile, evil, monstrous, horrid, and the shame of human reason and the terror of human virtue. That's the Protestant view. On the other hand, the Catholic Encyclopedia, which was published by American Catholics in the 20th century, tries to justify the Inquisition. It insists that critics of the Inquisition are ignoring important facts. Religious belief, it says, is something objective as a gift from God and is therefore outside the realm of free private judgment, close quote. In other words, religious belief is not a private opinion, but a public fact to be defended by force if necessary. Of course, in our own time, there are plenty of Christian nationalists who would agree with that statement, and quite a few Catholics who would not. Ironically, in fact, that was really one of the few things that Puritans, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Catholics all agreed on during the Reformation. They all held that religious belief was an objective fact to be defended through the use of force and deadly force if necessary. The problem was, of course, that they each had their own different version of that truth, and they fought religious wars and killed one another by the millions because of it. For the record, that was not the attitude of the earliest Christians, who didn't have the power to impose their religious opinions on others. As the New Testament tells us, early apostles did argue long and loud. And even the Catholic Encyclopedia reminds us that for the first 300 years, individual conscience was the guide to proper Christian practice because, and I'm quoting again, the acceptance of religion was a matter of free will, not of compulsion. It was Roman pagans that were the ones who tortured and killed those who disagreed, not early Christians. And this all changed as Christianity itself became Rome's state religion, Christianity absorbed Rome's imperial standards, including the policy that the machinery of state could and should enforce government-approved religious doctrine. When the Roman Empire collapsed 1,500 years ago, the church was really left as the only institution that could keep literate culture going in Europe, but that came at a price. For hundreds of years, the church itself became effectively the European government, setting standards for religious practice and also state policy. Europe's Jewish population worshipped outside church standards, of course, and Muslim invaders from North Africa colonized parts of Spain. But for the vast majority of Europeans, the church's authority was pretty much absolute. There were occasional disagreements between the clergy, but that was mostly limited to educated church officials who could read. Religious disputes rarely sifted down to the masses. Then about 1160, Peter Waldo, a reformer in the independent province of Languedoc in what is now France, began to preach that a truly Christian lifestyle required people to give up everything they owned and live in poverty. Now, that was not a new idea, but Peter Waldo developed a large following who called themselves Waldensians, and they became a headache for church fathers. First, talk about poverty made wealthy church officials look bad. Second, Waldo suggested that people had the power to gain their own salvation, and that was out-and-out heresy. So in 1179, a general meeting of bishops called the Third Lateran Council condemned the whole movement. Meanwhile, an even more troublesome movement was getting started, the Cathars. They included wealthy nobles and even some high church officials. Cathar priests openly criticized some church doctrines and policies, which was even worse than what Peter Waldo was doing. So in 1184, Pope Lucius III issued a decree called a papal bull titled Ad Abolendum, meaning for the abolition of. It excommunicated anyone who preached without proper authorization, which is what the Cathars were doing. Well, Peter Waldo also. The Waldensians and the Cathars no longer recognized Vatican authority, so excommunication didn't work. They'd already left. Both sides became violent. The Waldensians fled Languedoc and wound up in northern Italy, actually, but the more powerful and warlike Cathars fought back fiercely, and when they killed an important church official named Pierre de Castelnau, the Pope called for a crusade against the Cathars, and that was the beginning of what is now called the Inquisition. For the record, not all crusades took place in the Middle East. This one, called the Albigensian Crusade, violently stamped out Catharism, and then the French king seized Languedoc, making it a province of France. Meanwhile, the German Teutonic Knights conducted a genocidal crusade against non-Christians in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So those were two European crusades. But this church-state partnership violently oppressed non-believers time and again during the Inquisition. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda for the extermination of, which is I quoted in this morning's reading. And it prescribed exactly how church and state would work together. The Inquisition ran like a well-oiled machine. Local officials would begin by calling for information and accusations against local persons of interest. Anyone who wanted to denounce anyone else would be carefully listened to. The accusers' real motivations were rarely examined, and they did not have to face the people they accused. And then, if the officials agreed the case was worth prosecuting, the suspect would be arrested. They might not even know who had accused them. Ad extirpanda authorized torture for the first time to produce a religious confession. Because priests were men of God, and above such violence, state officials did the torturing using church guidelines. As the proclamation read, the torture couldn't be fatal, at least in theory, and bones couldn't be broken, at least in theory. One common tactic was to strap the victim to a table, stuff a rag in their mouth, and then pour water on the rag. Victims would choke and feel as though they were about to drown. And of course, today that's called, anybody? Waterboarding. If that didn't work, there were more brutal methods I won't go into detail. As historians Will and Ariel Durant note, the main torture was prolonged imprisonment. The victim was at the mercy of authorities. Relief was only possible if they confessed and named other heretics. Once accused, it was nearly impossible to prove yourself innocent, sort of like a visa worker or student facing deportation in the United States today. Moreover, you may remember from the reading that anyone who stood up for the accused was also subject to prosecution, whether they themselves were heretics or not. And I chose that part of the reading because it also reflects what our government is now beginning to do to people who speak out against government policies in our own time. The Inquisition isn't as far away as we might like to think. When the Inquisition came to a town, the only way for the accused to save their own soul and maybe survive was to totally cooperate and repent. And the climax was a ritual called the auto de fe, the act of faith, which had to be, they claimed, self-motivated. In mild cases, after the person confessed in public, they were reprimanded and their property was confiscated. In severe cases, the condemned heretic was then handed over to state authorities for execution, and then they burned the body. And of course, a suspect who refused to confess at all would be burned alive. For everyone except the victims, actually, this was a win-win situation. The public considered it high entertainment. Crowds would even shout down a victim sometimes who tried to confess because they wanted to see the burning. Church officials gained absolute power, government officials gained power as well, and local officials and informants got to split the property of the accused. Claiming the property of the persecuted might just be the next parallel to expect from our government. Today, we'll see. As with Christian nationalism today, the motivation was never purely religious. It was very much about power and money, same as deportations and Doge tactics today. The difference is that in the Inquisition, suspects tended to be people with property worth seizing. The wealthy, if accused, could avoid full prosecution by repenting and paying a fine. Of course, today's authoritarianism attacks the powerless, immigrants and government employees, in order to amass political power, which it then uses to appoint wealthy cronies to their political team. And in the end, a profit is made. As Will and Ariel Durant write, as money flowed into the coffers of the Inquisition, its officials became less zealous to preserve the Orthodox faith than to acquire gold, and corruption flourished piously. Close quote. Same thing now. It's not really about national security, securing our border, or about protecting our children, or really even about saving taxpayer dollars, because we're not doing that. Like the Inquisition, in the end, it's about personal greed and the lust for power. Everything else is just an easy-to-sell rationalization. Like reactionary lawmaking today, the Inquisition was put to different uses in different places. In the 15th century, when King Ferdinand of Aragon, not the one in the children's story, and Queen Isabella of Castile married and united their two kingdoms, Spain was at that point the most cosmopolitan nation in Europe. Jews and Muslims had been tolerated there for centuries. But it was also a divided land, not just between the Aragonians and the Castilians, but also the Muslim-controlled Emirate of Granada. Now, any good politician knows the best way to consolidate power is to find an enemy to fight. Today, it's trans people and immigrants. Ferdinand and Isabella used Muslims. They defeated the emir and drove the Muslims out of Spain. By 1492, they had united all Spain under their rule, and any Muslims who remained, and Jews as well, were forced to convert to Christianity. From one of the most religiously tolerant countries in the world, Spain became one of the least tolerant, which may sound familiar. When Ferdinand and Isabella became suspicious that new converts might still be practicing their old faith in private, they called for an inquisition. And the Durants write, the government was to pay the expenses and receive the net income of the Inquisition, but Ferdinand's motives were not just financial. The aim was to unify and consolidate Spain. That is, the Spanish Inquisition was about both money and power. Religious faith was the method, but not the only motivation. They appointed a cardinal inquisitor, Tomas de Torquemada, who had a reputation for cruelty. He was so bad that even the Pope at the time, Alexander VI, became worried. Alexander told Ferdinand and Isabella to reduce Torquemada's power and proceed more cautiously, but they ignored him, and their inquisition had taken on a life and force all its own. Several different popes protested over the centuries, but the Spanish Inquisition went on for 350 years, and from being the most cosmopolitan nation in Europe, it became a symbol of religious brutality. History is no simple thing. Today, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella are honored for uniting Spain, which they did, and also for laying the seeds of real Spanish greatness by commissioning Christopher Columbus's voyages. Their desire to spread and strengthen their faith was sincere. But the damage their ruthless methods did to thousands of innocent people arrested, stripped of property and livelihood, tortured, and even burned alive was also real. Looking back, it's tricky to judge people who live in very different times from ours. But looking from another angle, those times are not as different as we sometimes like to think. What will future generations say of us and our standards and our mistakes? The other striking thing is the consistency with which tyrants and demagogues of every age, including our own, use religion for politics. If good rulers did it all too much 500 years ago, bad rulers have also always done it and still do. When delegates came together to frame our own American Constitution, one key point was the equality of each member of society before the law, and they certainly didn't get that completely right. They institutionalized slavery, for one thing, and they didn't think of women at all. But again, it's a waste of time to judge those who lived hundreds of years ago. It's our job to improve on their mistakes. The framers do deserve credit for their real concern about the relationship between church and state. I don't think they feared an inquisition. Rather, they were concerned to avoid a repetition of the religious wars of the Protestant Reformation, religious violence between different Christian traditions. had been a long-term problem and was well in memory. And they knew their history well enough to see the problem when religion became too closely entwined with even a well-administered state. Those are powerful dynamics, and they understood how easily a church-state combine can rage out of control. Today, more and more politicians call for increasing cooperation between church and government, and they are dead wrong. Religion is at its best when it stands as a respectful adversary to the state, as Pope Francis did for much of his life, for example. It is every church's job to speak truth to power, not to assist the state in wielding it. The church's job is to call attention to the misdeeds of the powerful in every sphere, government, corporate, cultural, and religious, to continue to learn and apply the hard lessons of the past, and to call each of us away from our own selfishness and the shadow side of our own natures to aspire toward a better future for all people. We are not put here to agree with one another. We are put here to learn to live with our differences, to acknowledge our mistakes and weaknesses, and to support one another in striving for something better. We won't get it right. People never have. But if we remain humble and keep trying, perhaps we can make space for our children to get it more right than we did. Shalom, salam, blessed be, and amen.
Started out as a feeling, which then grew into a hope, which then turned into a quiet thought, which then turned into